Is America truly ready for the next great conflict? And what does it mean both abroad, here, and at home? That is the question. And first of all, the defense secretary or the war secretary basically gathered almost every U.S. general and admiral at Quantico in a sweeping secretive meeting that laid down some quite interesting discussion. What did they do? Well, basically, they brought all these generals in one room, pushing reform, discipline, command authority, and combat readiness, backed by a fierce appearance by President Trump himself. He was there. At the same time, Washington has been sounding the alarm on China. The Pentagon admits that the U.S. could burn through precision weapon in days if war broke out. China is scaling up its arsenal of missiles. At the same time, the Pentagon admits that China is scaling up its arsenal of missiles, drones, and warships at an industrial pace. And America is scrambling to catch up. The new push with U.S. weapon manufacturers is being billed as the arsenal of democracy 2.0. Double missing lines. You got to produce more missiles. You got to doubling the missile lines, stockpiling artillery, and fast-breaking AI weapons. But this is where it gets even more striking. While the Pentagon is preparing for confrontation abroad, troops are also being deployed inside U.S. cities, from Portland to Chicago to Washington. What's going on? Invasion from within? No, maybe they're just doing war games. Because don't forget, this is not checkers. This is chess. So what we're doing is that we're doing multiple things. We're chewing bubble gum and walking at the same time. That's what we're doing here. And this is very important for you to understand what the heck are they up to. And what are they up to? This is what we're going to try to figure out. What's really happened at the general meetings? We don't really know. Where is the U.S. stands versus China in war readiness? Are we ready for this war? And how is the weapons industry being pushed to scale in a way that it hasn't in decades? There's not enough missiles to fight wars, especially against China. So, let's see what's going on. Where do we stand? Where do we stand right now in terms of the the ability to actually circumvent China? And is that a possibility? Right? Can the U.S. actually produce what it thinks it needs? That is the question, and it's a big question because let us review in details what it is that the U.S. has, where does the U.S. stand and its ability to muster the forces necessary in the event that something starts, and you might be very surprised. So let's take a look, first of all, at the advantages that the U.S. has. Well, first of all, number one, the U.S. has good global posture and alliance network. Right? The U.S. maintains an extensive network of overseas bases and alliances in NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines. Well, having said that, you should know that as far as NATO is concerned right now, it's a little bit of a problem, right? As you've seen, Russia is testing NATO. It's sending drones, ships, and I'll do a live on that. Ships that basically scorning the NATO seas. A ship yesterday got stopped in France. What are you doing? And some of them are cutting cables underneath the ocean. Cables that transport lots of information that could be very important during the war. Or where do you think all of your internet traffic goes? It goes under the ocean through this huge cable, and lots of Russian ships has been going around. And so NATO is basically, this thing that was created after World War II to fight, to fight and to have a front against Russia. But what is NATO really doing at the end of the day, right? Because they've been invaded, they've been poked, they've been trucked, they've been prodded by Russia, but NATO is not doing anything. NATO is, they're not, I mean, there were ships, there were planes, there were fighter planes from Russia that flew over NATO territory. Never mind the Ukraine war, never mind Ukraine. There's been drones after drones. Recently, Germany, Denmark had to stop their airport because of all these drones. So there's something going on overseas, and there's something going on in the U.S. Trying to look past the rhetoric, the meeting of the generals, the deployment in U.S. cities, and the push by the U.S. government to tell the weapon manufacturers that you need to produce more weapons. Now, the U.S. also, number two, the U.S. has technological edge and integration and system advantage. On many high-end systems, like the stealth aircraft, which we've heard, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, command and control systems, precision ammunition, network platform, the U.S. still leads, or at least is more mature in fielding integrated battle-tested architecture. So there's that advantage. The U.S. also benefits from decades of experience integrating, because the thing when you have something like that, these people need to talk to each other in a very, very fast. So the U.S. is pretty good at that, integrating multi-domain operations, air, land, sea, in contested environments. So to that end, the U.S. is doing well. Number three, undersea. Sure, submarine dominance. The U.S. operates a large fleet of nuclear submarines with long endurance, stealth, and strike capabilities. In contrast, China's submarine force is smaller. That is a fact, and less capable in many respects. So that's good. And of course, number four, nuclear deterrent and strategic depth. The U.S. has a more mature, tried redundancy and global posture in its strategic nuclear forces. China is expanding its nuclear forces rapidly, but the U.S. still holds advantages in reserve, delivery mechanism, and integration with early warning systems. But, and this is the but of that story, China's gain and areas of increasing strength, and this is what I want my subscribers and my members to understand. Rapid modernization and scaling. China has been investing heavily in modernizing its military. New ships. China is the largest manufacturer of ships in the world. Missiles. That's where all the new... This is how war is being conducted right now, through missiles. Aircraft. Missiles right now, you may or may not know that Ukraine is having more and more difficulties stopping the missiles coming from Russia. The Patriot missiles are, losing ground a bit there. Integrated air defenses and long-range strike systems. The DoD in China report notes that the PLA is emphasizing readiness, real combat training, and institutional reform. What does that mean? Well, real combat training, you may or may not know, check out some of my past videos, that China and Russia have been conducting war games together. Together they've been fighting together. They've been playing around. They've been coordinating. Okay? Number two, regional concentration and geographic advantage. Nearshore operations favors China, shorter supply lines. I mean, there's a war over there. They're on top of each other. It's easy to have supply lines, local concentration of forces, and territorial control. China can mass forces near contested area with less logistical overhead compared to the U.S., who's trying to project forces across the Pacific. What the U.S. is doing through its Quad platform, which means that's supposed to involve India, it's supposed to involve Japan, Australia, and the U.S. Quad. But that Quad is not as strong as the BRICS. It's not really communicating, especially with what's going on. Especially what's going on with China right now, right? With India, I would say that that's a problem, right? In fact, I would say it says a lot of damage right now, right? Take a look, for example, at the regional concentration and geographic advantages they have. Missile, number 3. What is China's gain? Number 3, I'll tell you what. Missile and strike modernization. China is rapidly fielding hypersonic weapons, advanced ballistic missiles. And that's a problem, because without these missiles, it becomes more and more difficult to fight a war. You need that ability to do it. You need the ability to actually gather those forces. So China is fielding hypersonic weapons, counter-access, system aimed at complicating U.S. intervention. The PLA rocket force practices live fire strikes and is improving its readiness to strike airfields, ships, and keynotes. Number 4, institutional reform. Training under combat conditions. The PLA is pushing changes to make training more realistic and warfighting oriented. Actual combat drills, scenario drills, combined arm exercises. China's system being more centrally controlled, after all, you don't need that many people to decide, can prioritize long-term military goals with less political friction. Key challenges and vulnerabilities to the U.S. Well, readiness shortfall and modernization. Lag. The U.S. faces what many analysts describe as a readiness crisis. Aging equipment, maintenance backlog, supply chain fragility, and slower modernization in some programs. Some part of the U.S. Air Force and other branches are grappling with aging fleets and delays in procuring next-generation replacement. You can understand why the U.S. is a bit concerned, why they're getting together, why they're trying to train, why they're pushing the industries in the U.S. to listen. You got to build more weapons. Logistic and sustainment over distances. Deploying large forces across the Pacific, sustaining them in contested environment is inherently more difficult than operating closer to home. Force structure, constraint, and force generation. The U.S. must balance global commitments, Europe, Middle East, deterrence everywhere, while preparing for possible peer-level conflict in the Pacific. I mean, the U.S. is all over the place, right? The U.S. is, dealing with Israel. The U.S. is dealing with India, trying to bring India back into the fray. Right? The U.S. is in the Middle East, sending weapons to Israel, sending weapons to Ukraine, right, so they could fight their war. At the same time, China is preparing. China is building. China is strategizing. China, for example, late last year, early this year, started to get mighty close to India. You have to understand that at one point, India and China had fought a war. And only in 2025, before the tariff, did China started to have direct flights to India. And of course, this culminated very recently in September in this meeting where all three of them, the Russian, the Indian, and the Chinese got together. Now, if you're in the U.S., you got to start moving. You got to do something, right? And that's what it's being conveyed as being doing. Looks past the rhetoric. They're putting places on the board, on the chessboard, in order to prepare for whatever comes next. And innovation speed relative to China's scaling. China is making aggressive investment in hypersonic, AI-enabling system, missile saturation, and industrial-scale defense production. The U.S. must keep pace not just in breakthrough tech, but in scaling deployment. Yeah, you could have the greatest scientists in the world, right? You could have the greatest scientists working for you, but at the same time, you need to be able to fight a war. Right? You need to be able to fight a war. You need to be able to deploy. You need to be able to actually, generate some interest. You need to be able to get these people together. You need to get them all to, you need to produce the weapon. Otherwise, what's the point? So overall, the U.S. is still ahead, but the margin is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. on the net, the U.S. remains ahead in many of the critical dimension that matters for a high-intensity, long-duration war. However, the margin is narrowing in key contested domains, especially in China's neighborhood. In some scenarios, the local balance would shift to Chinese favor, especially early in the conflict. Much will depend on time escalation dynamics, whether the U.S. can mobilize, surge, reinforce, and sustain in the force of an anti-Axis efforts, and whether China can press advantages quickly. Is the U.S. really ready? That's the question here, right? So how does this tie with the recent push you may or may not aware? And this is what I'm here to tell you, that the U.S. has been recently pushing with U.S. weapon manufacturers, right? The U.S. government's recent push with domestic weapon manufacturers is a response to exactly the narrowing gap with China. So what does that mean? Well, number one, the Pentagon has warned that in a high-end fight with China, especially around Taiwan or the South Sea, the U.S. could burn through precision munitions, especially missiles, interceptors, long-range fires in days or weeks. You do not have enough weapon to last a long time. And the weapon, we're not talking about submarines. They're not going to be fought with submarines. They're going to be fought with missiles. You do not have enough missiles. To address this, the Department of Defense, Department of War, is pressuring defense contractors to expand production lines, secure critical components, rocket motors, microelectronics, and shorten timelines. The U.S. is pushing to double missile productions, Tomahawk, defense interceptors, explicitly citing a China conflict scenario. Why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that. They're doing that because right now, as you notice, China is not paying attention. China is not paying attention to the U.S. They're still negotiating, right? They're going back and forth. Meanwhile, China is saying, you know what? I am not going to give you as many of those rare earth minerals that you want because I know that's what you need to build your weapons. The signs are there, my friend. The signs are there. You need to read them. Number two, there's a shift to arsenal of democracy 2.0. Analysts see the current push as an attempt to recreate an industrial war-fighting capacity, not just boutique low-volume production. This means moving away from fragile just-in-time supply chains and reshoring or friend-shoring critical materials. We got to get the stuff. You got to get the rare earth minerals. Where are you going to get them? Right? Because for years, the U.S. didn't do it. Europe either. Why? Well, because China did it. You have to understand that rare earth minerals are a critical component of missiles and weapons. And therefore, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Therefore, there is a need to get it. And to get it, it would take 10 to 12 years. And China did it because it's very dirty. Nobody wanted to have the pollution associated with rare earth minerals. And they did it. And they have advantage. 80% of the world production is in China. So this means moving away from fragile just-in-time. It also means investing in attributable system, cheap drones. Remember the drones? You hear more and more about those. Loitering ammunition, AI enabling swarms, sending thousands of drones at the same time. Look what is happening in NATO countries right now. Look at the drones. There are drones everywhere. Of course, no one can tell you for sure that they come from Russia, but they're coming from somewhere and they're doing something. Right? At least they're stopping flights from taking off in Denmark, Copenhagen, Germany, France. Readiness and sustainment. The U.S. readiness versus China isn't just about troops and doctrine. It's about whether the arsenal can sustain a long war. You need, see what's happening with Israel, right? It's been fighting for 2-3 years. Ukraine, that's how long a war can last. Do you have enough weapon? Well, the U.S. had plenty of weapon, kind of sold or gave them away, but now, not enough. The new push with manufacturers is meant to close that gap before a potential Pacific crisis. You heard it here, folks. So number 4, technology adoption and delays. While China is scaling fast, the U.S. defense sector is struggling to bring AI, autonomous weapons, and hypersonics into production quickly enough. What's happening is the U.S. is still fighting the previous war, right? Submarines, boats, planes. It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be about cyber warfare. It's going to be about lots of things. Reports note that AI weapons programs are delayed due to testing, ethics review, and procurement red tape, which China does not have. This creates a tension. The U.S. still leads many prototype and cutting-edge R&D, but if production isn't scaled, the battlefield advantage shrinks, and that's a problem. The Biden and Trump transition and now Secretary Hegseth's agenda both ties into this. Pushing defense firms harder is partly about deterrence signaling to Beijing. By showing that the U.S. is building stockpiles, ramping missile lines, and revitalizing its arsenal, Washington hopes to deter China from thinking it could quickly overwhelm U.S. forces. What do you think? You say, you know what, we're going to call it the Department of War. Right? We're not going to call it something else. We're going to call it the Department of War. Why do you think they're doing that? For that specific reason. So the tying is direct. The U.S. is ahead but stretched thin. China is scaling fast. To preserve readiness, Washington is leaning on its defense industrial base, essentially trying to rebuild Cold War-style surge capacity so the U.S. can fight and sustain a long war. Not just a short, high-intensity burst. So that's important to know. That is important to understand because this is going to be a lot of damage at some point. So China starts to work closer, stronger, and with deeper local stockpile. U.S. maintains tech edges, but the most recent U.S. weapon manufacturer push is about rebuilding surge capacity. So there's been a lot of deployments in the U.S., Portland, Washington, Chicago. Yes, the deployment of troops can plausibly be connected to the broader shifts that we've been talking about. But the link is indirect and mediated by political, legal, and institutional constraint. What is the U.S. really doing? Are we taking over? No, maybe they're just getting ready, to move troops around quickly. I mean, there were 200 National Guards in Portland and in Washington D.C. I mean, they started being armed with M17 pistol and M4 rifles during the patrols. In Chicago, the administration has requested deployment of 100 troops to Illinois. These deployments are mostly National Guard, not full-scale active duty Army Marine units, at least as publicly disclosed. So what makes those deployment as possible interpretation, right? So putting it all together, here are some plausible readings that we could see. So you have the signaling of strength and deterrence. Just as military posture is being realigned to deter China, the administration may be trying to signal that it can project force. Normalization of domestic military presence. Over time, deploying force in domestic setting may shift norms, making it easier to reuse and escalate such deployments. What does that mean? Well, basically, we're used to moving troops around. You may not like it. You may think, this is dictatorship or whatever. No, we're just practicing. We're practicing back and forth. Domestic security. The official explanation is often tied to protecting federal facilities. That's why we're doing it. But usually, the way it works is never what it appears. It's what's behind it. That is what you need to worry about. That is what you need to say. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This is important. Deployment becomes an experiment on how far the administration can push the role of military forces internally, legally and operationally. It's possible that these moves also serve political objectives. So is there a war readiness versus China and this push internally, well, the tie is indirect, but it's real. The broader push to ramp up defense production, modernize and reassert military cohesion is about external readiness. I mean, the domestic deployment can serve as a complement to that push. So if the administration can shift norms about where military forces may appear, that complements an expansive view of U.S. power. We are moving it. We are shaking it. And it's happening as we speak. In short, deployment to Poland, Chicago, and Washington are unlikely to be primarily about preparing for war with China, right? But they are consistent with a politically military doctrine that sees internal control, projection of force, and readiness for confrontation. That may be what is happening here. And that is something to be concerned. All right? So what to watch out for next? I mean, I know it's complex. There's lots of issue going on, and I want you guys to understand what's happening. But, you know, whether further deployments are going to happen, I don't know. We shall see. But there's a plot line being developed here. Not sure exactly what it ends, but we know what it started. Right? And that's important to understand because at the end of the day, what you want to make sure is you want to make sure you understand what is happening. Okay? And I would say this. The U.S. right now is in the midst of a change. And it's not just driven by it to be the biggest and the baddest. No, it's in a change. It's in a global change, right? Because from an industrial basis, the U.S. is losing ground. That's number one. Well, I mean, for example, in the U.S. does not produce its own rare earth mineral. Okay, well, let's forget the war for a second. Fine. Well, let's talk about the ability to make your own medicine. For example, the U.S. doesn't make vaccines, as we know. The U.S. doesn't make its own medications. Most of it comes from China or India, right? And that's highly dependent. The U.S. is losing the war, or at least the race on the ability to generate its own semiconductors. Solar panels are all made in China. Okay, so you have to be very careful when you hear the rhetoric that, oh, you know, it's their fault. What are they doing? It doesn't make any sense. On top of that, you have a shutdown, so it doesn't help. But we'll talk about that later on. The point is that there's something going on here that is at play. You know what's going on? Because be careful, be very careful, because you might think, well, we're waiting for the Chinese to attack, right? That's the most logical thing to think. The Chinese are going to attack. The Chinese are going to attack us. But let me tell you something. While the U.S. is trying to catch up to China, what if it? And China really doesn't want to take over. China basically is all about, and you saw it. I mean, they had this meeting with the Chinese, the Russian, and the Indian. Right? They got together. China wants to become a powerful force over there. Doesn't want to conquer the world. It's not about that. It's about basically being a major power in the Asia region. And what's happening is the U.S. is being forgotten. The U.S. is not being paying attention. Well, listen. It's there. Look at it. What do I mean? Well, first of all, when was the last time the U.S. got a meeting with the Chinese? Right? Nobody's paying attention to the U.S. Right? Yes, there was a meeting with the Russian, but that's about it. That's the only thing that happened here. There was nothing came out of it. In fact, people are making fun that the U.S. can't stop the war in Ukraine. Okay, make fun of the U.S. The U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on India. Did that change their mood? No, they're still insisting on buying oil from Russia. That's not working. They're not paying attention either. Although um, India was a quote-unquote great friend of the U.S. Well, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that's what's happening right now? Not so sure, not so sure. And of course, the U.S. is still trying to get a final agreement with China, which is withholding the tremendous amount of rare earth minerals. So it's not happening. It is not happening. They cannot get in there. And it's trying to, also trying to get India away from China and Russia, but no. So what could happen? Well, with the general coming on board, the fact that you want everyone to start building more weapons, and the fact that Russia is out of control, you should know that wars have been started for economic reasons. And war might not be started by who do you think could start a war. Let me tell you. You may not like this second part, but I need to tell you because this channel is about looking for black swan. Right? When people say the war of the 20th century, they usually mean the World War I, 1914, 1918, which was a truly ending event in the century, right? But it wasn't caused by one thing, but economics was deeply entangled with the politics. You should know that industrial competition, by the 1900s, Germany had overtaken Britain in steel, chemicals. 1900, right? Stay with me here. Germany had overtaken Britain in steel, chemicals, and many manufacturing goods. This upset Britain's long-standing dominance. Sounds familiar? Colonial competition. European powers, Britain, France, Germany, were in a scramble for Africa and Asia, partly to secure raw materials. Sounds familiar? And Europe was split into two rival blocs, France, Britain, and Russia versus Germany, Australia, and Italy. In the Balkans, Slavic nationalism, pan-German and pan-Slav ideology, militarism, trigger event, the assassination of Duke Ferdinand. But that's not the reason why. There were economic situation built behind, and just at some point you just need a reason to start fighting, and then you got it. So yes, economic rivalries were a huge underlying cause, but they worked together with nationalism, sounds familiar, militarism, and rigid alliances. So World War II. All right, let's talk about World War II. World War II triggered by imperial rivalry and nationalism. But World War II was shaped far more directly by economics. Again, economics. The Treaty of Versailles basically shedded everything away from Germany. And the reparation caused a debt crisis, hyperinflation, and later austerity. That's how Hitler went into power. The Great Depression, 1929. Global collapse of trade, banking, and employment. In Germany, unemployment exceeded 30%. In Japan, economic crisis and lack of natural resources pushed leaders towards expansion to secure markets and raw materials. Do not underestimate the power of economics to start a war. Whom do you think is going to start a war? I'll tell you. Japan liked oil, iron, and coal. And what did they do? Germany wanted liberalism, living space in Eastern Europe to secure farmland and resources. Italy under Mussolini thought colonies, Ethiopia, believe it or not. The US and Britain stuck to protectionism, tariffs, and quota in the 30s. Does it sound familiar? So, Nazi Germany ran a war economy. Does this sound familiar? That's exactly what Russia has right now, a war economy, before the war even started. So, wars have been started because of economic reasons. And that's something that I want my subscribers, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I got many more important topics. Now, who could start this war? Well, it's not impossible, right? That if China and the US cannot agree on a trade agreement, China tomorrow could just close itself off and say, you know what? I don't want dollars anymore. I don't want dollars. I don't want to buy from you anymore. I am buying oil from Russia. I could sell my products to India. And you know what? We're getting along just fine. We don't need the U.S. anymore. So if you want your generic drugs, which you're getting 100% out of the country, and if you want your rare earth minerals, and if you want your semiconductors, go get it somewhere else because we're not giving it to you anymore. Then who do you think is going to start a war? Right? The U.S. The U.S. might be pushed into starting a war. Believe it or not. And it doesn't take much, and we have the people and power to do it. So, does the U.S. have a reason right now? This is becoming very important now. Does the U.S. right now have a reason for war based on economic necessity? I mean, the U.S. today is not in the same position as Germany and Japan, obviously, but economic necessity has always been a hidden driven of war. At the end of the day, it's about the dollar, the money. As the U.S. has gone to war for economic reasons, yeah, and that's why you need to know the history. And this channel is important. I want you to subscribe to this channel so you get a bit of perspective. You need to understand what's happening in the world that you're living. The Spanish-American War, remember that one? 1898. I remember that one. That was a very interesting war. Basic at that time, markets in Cuba, the Philippines, plus the sugar trade, plus strategic access to Asia. That was the reason. World War II, Pacific Front. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because the U.S. cut off oil and steel exports. Iraq, 2003, often framed as the weapons of mass destruction, but oil and Middle East energy secured loom in the background. So, okay, that's the past. How about today? Well, today's U.S. economic realities. Debt and fiscal pressure. U.S. national debt is over $35 trillion. If you start a war, maybe you don't need to repay all that money. Historically, war can, quote-unquote, reset debt burdens via inflation, resource grabs, or restructure global order. Think Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods happened after World War II. At the end of World War II, the U.S., Russia, and England sat together and say, okay, now that we won the war, what do? What are we going to use as a currency? Who's going to be doing what? UK kind of lost the war because they were so indebted. I mean, they didn't lose the war, but they lost that discussion at Bretton Woods. They basically lost the power they used to have. And the U.S. took over because the U.S. had no debt. But now the U.S. in the same position as the UK. So, yeah, historically, war can reset debt burden via inflation, resource grabs, or structured global order. Number two, trade and industrial competition. We're trying to start off for those. U.S. depends on these manufacturing. I mean, critical mineral panels. China controls 70 to 80% of global earth, essential for fighters, missiles, EV, and semiconductors. You know what? If you don't want to sell it to me, you'll come and get it. Conflict with security supply dependence. This is not possible. Number three, energy security. The U.S. is energy independent on paper, but global oil eruption still hits U.S. consumers. Protect sea lanes is economic and necessary. Be careful. China is careful about the U.S. China shouldn't think that the U.S. do certain things. Hey, it's got like hundreds of generals in a matter of days. The U.S. is invading its cities. The U.S. is hard production weapons in a mass kind of way. So, the U.S. dollar is the world reserve currency. War often enforces them. You're going to have to use my dollar as a reserve currency. Take dominance. AI, chips, 5G, it's now seen as geopolitical survival. If I don't have access to this, I'm going to become irrelevant. And the U.S. is in the process of becoming irrelevant. And that's the issue. Semiconductors are as strategically vital to the U.S. today as Middle Eastern oil was in the 20th century. Could the U.S. claim economic necessity for war? Yes. I mean, it wouldn't be framed that way publicly. You have to use it, right? You say, well, maybe invade 108 so that I turn get in there, right? So secure supply chains, conductors, defending trade routes, South China Sea, Taiwan, right? The Strait of Hormuz, preserving global financial leadership, prevent one of the BRICS currencies from overtaking the dollar. we are slowly getting close to that preventing strategic goals. Ensuring adversaries don't have forces. They got meeting together. In fact, something about when these three together, say, what are you playing against me? If I'm telling you, they. And the difference is, obviously, German and Japan for survival required new land resources. The US, they face more relative land risk. But how long do you think that's going to last? Right? How long do you think before the US decides enough is enough? I want to be in charge. I want to know what is going on, and I want to stop it. You guys are getting too close together. That is a concern. And of course, in terms of inflation, the U.S. is trying to fight inflation, obviously. The U.S. is trying to become relevant. The U.S. is trying to prevent all these people to be together. The U.S. is trying to prevent further war in the Middle East. The U.S. is trying to stop the war with Ukraine and Russia. The U.S. is doing lots and lots of things at the same time. You may agree or may not agree as the way it's being done, but it's happening, it's being done, and therefore we need to make sure that we understand that principle, because if the U.S. gets shot out too long, too far, and too rough, it may decide something. I would love to know what you think. Right? So don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because it is very helpful to understand the world that you are living in.